Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, I'm going to be giving you a bit of an update on some of our core component updates in Contensis and what's coming in Contensis 15.1. So for those of you who are new to our webinars, I'm Richard Saunders. I'm the Contensis product owner. I help set the direction of the product alongside the Chief Product Officer, Si, and our CTO, Rich Chivers. So let's just dive straight in. There's lots to cover today. So one of the first features that we're going to be releasing as part of 15.1 is the idea of nested components. And this is about making your components more modular that align with your design systems and more appropriate to delivering front-end components that align with your content model. So just to give a quick snapshot and a bit of background to components. Components basically allow you to group different types of related fields together that can be then used across multiple content types. Think about it as defining a reusable structure like an address or opening times or something like social cards that might be reused. When you use a component, it's usually focused on delivering single-use content, so content that will exist in one entry but isn't likely to be reused in others. For that, we can use linked entries. Components also allow us to create flexible front-end components based on the same data model or content structure. And that can look something like this. We can have a data card component depicted here on the left-hand side of the screen that has a bunch of fields assigned to it, a title, a description, maybe an image, and a link. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got three different front-end components that can consume that data and display it in the way that's appropriate. So hero banner, they've all got title, description, and a link, but obviously the image here is used as a background image, whereas a card, it's used at the top of the screen, and a promotion with call to action might be a smaller image in the center of the component itself. So that's kind of the flexible data structure approach. Predominantly, we're using components as well in page builder experience. So when you're using a composer field to build up blocks of content or of components on something like a homepage or a landing page. So here you can see our Leaf demo project, and here in the center, just bringing into focus now, is this promoted product component. And this promoted product is made up of a bunch of fields within Contensis. So we've got a series of links at the top to pots, plants, and foliage. We've got a product title, a product description, a product URL or link through the Find Out More button, and we've got the primary image for that product. So in the CMS, we might have some fields that look like this, or alternatively, look like this. So in a component today in Contensis, we've got this promoted product at the center, and one of the first fields on the left-hand.
Okay.
And on the left-hand side, we've got a product, and that product is an entry picker. So it allows you to connect to different entries. So you could select that Canary Island palm product in the entry editor. But then to create those reusable links that we saw at the top of the screen, you'd have to have a field for the label of the link and another field to specify the URL of the link. So each of those links would then be defined as link number 1, link number 2, link number 3. That ends up looking like in the content type, something like this. So we've got the three different links depicted and the product. And this is looks a little bit chaotic and not very flexible. How do you inform the user that they need to populate 1, 2, or 3? Like, it doesn't give that kind of flexibility. What if you want to restrict it to just 2 items? What about if you want to reorder those items in the entry editor? All that becomes a little bit more difficult. And that same link definition might be used in another component. So you'll be repeating this process of setting that up. So where do nested components come in? Well, in that same example, we've got a promoted product with an entry picker to select the product, that Canary Island palm. But we could have a new field, which is a component field, a nested component, which we couldn't do previously. And we can call that secondary buttons. And we can mark that up as being repeatable. And then we have this new button component, which defines the URL and the label for the button that can be reused. And you can see in the center of the screen that I've set up a definition that says, to validate this, I need between 1 and 3 buttons displayed within this component. So how does that look? Well, it certainly simplifies the component builder. We've now just got 2 fields, a product field as an entry picker and the new button component assigned. And as you can see on the right of this screen, I've toggled on the option to say allow multiple secondary buttons to be added. And a new feature is to also depict what the add component button actually says on the screen. And this is to make it clearer when you're scrolling through the entry editor, what those buttons are actually going to do, but also makes it more accessible as well. So for screen reader users that might be using the screen, they can use the rotor control, go down to the button action of add a call to action button and get straight to it without necessarily having to read the entire screen. So a little accessibility improvement there. So that's enough of me talking about the theory and the background to it. Let's go and see it in practice in the CMS. So if I just switch over, let's have a look at the component again, just to refresh ourselves. So what we're doing in the CMS now is we're going to go and have a look at how this component is created today, and how we can update that component to support this pattern of reusable buttons. Now, this Leaf project, when it was built, we've actually hard-coded these buttons, so they can't actually be changed at the moment from a CMS user. Somebody would have to update the front-end component in order to change these links, which is a bit poor, but it's an ideal candidate for us to change that today. So let's take a look. Here is the home page. So find this perfect plant. So it's on the home page where I've got this component. If I click on the body area, you might have noticed we've got this new tab description at the top of the screen. So you can actually specify these in the content type builder now, to give a bit more of a cue to your users what the content is used for in these tabs. But here we've got the Canary Island date palm. At the moment, this is an entry picker, as we saw from the screenshot earlier, and all it allows me to do is to select a particular product from the list. And that product selection will then determine what image is used, what the title text is, what the description text is on the front end component. And it doesn't give me any of that flexibility of controlling the buttons. So how can we go about doing that? Well, let's go to the component builder. I've just mocked out the data as well for you to kind of get an appreciation of what it would have looked like previously and what it would look like today with nested components. So I'm just going to go into that promoted product. So here it is again. So I've got a product entry picker that allows me to select plants or pots to be used for that promoted product. And to achieve the links that we see at the top here, pots, plants, and foliage, I would have to specify a link, label, and select each pot. And I'd have to do it in the right order, because at the moment, link label 1, 2, and 3 would result in our front end component of being displayed across the screen 1, 2, 3. That's the most logical way that you would have consumed it on the front end. So how does that change today with nested components? Well, firstly, we need a component that depicts a button. So we can look at a button component. And you can see here I've got my button label. I can use one of 2 selection methods for that link. I can either specify a manual URL or a link to an external site, which is just a text field with validation assigned to it of a website address. or a linked entry. So choose a plan to part, a product listing, or any other of these content types as well. And the label is just a text field. You'll also notice that we get this message at the top of the screen to say this component is actually used by another component. It's part of a nested component. So I can't actually add any more components into this. We don't allow sort of multiple nesting to occur. Otherwise you end up with this kind of inception approach to components and becomes really kind of complicated in the UI. So it's one level deep. And it also mentions that you can use the usage panel. So under the property panel, you find usage. So you can actually see now that this nested component, this button component, is actually used in my promoted product. And I can actually click through here and open up that promoted product for editing. And so now today we've got our product selector and our simplified view now. We've just got a button component inserted by clicking on the component, searching for button and inserting it here. And as we saw in the screenshot earlier on, we've set this up to be multiple, allows multiple selection of those buttons. And here I can specify what that button will say when I come to add it to the screen. So I've put add a call to action button. You can set up validation. At the moment, there's no validation. So when I come to create the content, it would allow me to put many, many buttons across that front end component. But what I can do now is I can say I actually want to limit it to say a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 3 buttons to be used. So let's save and publish that change. Let's go back to the entry, go back to the home page now. And what you won't have seen is I've already added this component just for brevity to, I actually set 2 items. I've already added this into here, so I've already set the content for us. But we can see this validation now has kicked in. I'd set 2 and it's saying it's requiring between 1 and 2. So I need to remove 1, otherwise it won't let me save this entry. So now I've got the product. I can select my promoted product from the screen and choose any plant or pot. And then I've got these secondary buttons and they open up in the inline flyout. So we give a real focused view in editing that content rather than showing all that nested content in line in a composer. We've just cleaned it up and said, anytime that there is a nested component inside a composer, open it up in the flyout. So the editing experience is a bit clearer. And I've selected the Boston fern. I've given it its label and the same with aloe vera. So if I save this entry now. Just going to refresh my page. If we scroll down, you can see here's the promoted product component. I've selected aloe vera, which is depicted here. And then I've got Boston fern and aloe vera. I've duplicated the content, so I can go in and change that now. So let's go and change that to something else. Select a new entry, change it to, I don't know, Chinese money plant, and change this text to Chinese money plant. Save that. I actually want it to be the first one, so I'll just reorder it. Hit save. Now when I refresh this page, you should see that change made at the bottom of the screen. So we've got Chinese money plant and the Boston fern, and the order's been changed, and we've got our promoted product. So that's a quick overview of nested components. We know it's going to be really useful for reproducing things like accordions that might have a title that has a bunch of accordion items and maybe a call to action on an accordion row in the page builder. We've seen other uses of nested addresses or additional contact information for individual people. So yeah, we see that being used for lots of different use cases. So with nested components, you saw the kind of component usage that comes along with it, allowing us to kind of see how that component's used, when a component is nested inside something else, and what content type that component is used in. So it allows you to navigate around and get an understanding. You can customize the button text, bringing accessibility support for those who are just going straight into kind of button actions who are rotor controlled with something like VoiceOver, and also makes it clearer to your end users of actually what they're doing. One of the things you didn't quite see was the edit components in line. So if you've got a component in a content type, you can click the triple dot on the field now and click on edit component, and it will edit that component in line for you. And obviously the benefit of components and using your content in components rather than linked entries for content that's got a single use is they become searchable as part of that kind of base entry of the content as well. So saves a search lookup. So the next thing we're going to be introducing in 15.1, and I'm not going to be able to do a live demo today because we're just finishing off the UI at the moment, is the introduction of entry scheduling. This is going to allow you to publish and expiry entries automatically based on a date that you set. So I don't know, a new product's going out on Monday and you want to make that page live at 8 o'clock in the morning, you'll be able to do that. You've got a bunch of content on the site or a page of entry of content that you want to remove from the site at midnight tomorrow. You can do that also by setting an expiry schedule. So to do this, we've had to build an entirely new scheduling service or task service in the background. And this is providing the backbone of not only entry schedules, but it's going to provide us ways of scheduling blocks in the future. So if you're involved in the blocks webinar a few weeks ago, if you had this idea of an import block or an integration block that carries out a set of tasks at a set date and time or on a set schedule, you'll use this scheduling service for that blocks to utilize. So it's got multiple uses. We've updated our workflow API to support the setting and managing of publishing and expiry schedules. And this has had the benefits of us being able to now republish entries without making those small changes that you have to make when an entry is unpublished. That can now occur. So that's one of the kind of outcomes from refactoring our workflow API. You'll be able to permission who can manage schedules as well, and this will be linked to your entry content types, roles and permissions. So if you want somebody to be able to manage like news content type and have schedules set on news content type, you can do that. Alternatively, you can prevent users from setting a schedule on another content type. We need to make obviously a bunch of changes to the entry editor and the entry listing to support this. So you'll now have, there's a new panel on the right hand side, and that panel allows you to set schedules. If you're setting a publish schedule, you'll get a dialog like this where you can set the date and time, hit the schedule button. It will result in showing that a schedule is set for publish, where you can clear it, who actually set it. And then when you open up an entry, you can actually see that this has one schedule currently assigned to it as the publishing schedule. Once something has been marked as having a publish or expiry schedule, in the entry listing, you'll be able to filter the workflow statuses to understand if something has been scheduled for publishing. So there's a difference between setting a publish date and actually something ending up in a scheduled for publishing state. So if you're using basic workflow and you set a publish schedule, it'll go straight into this scheduled for publishing workflow state, or this bucket of entries ready to publish. This occurs because when you have an approval workflow and somebody has set a date to say, I want this new product to go out next week. Well, you don't want it to go out next week without it being approved. So for the time being, that entry will remain in the approval workflow and will result in being in the awaiting approval workflow state until somebody says approve and schedule. And it's at that point a task will be added to our task service, and the entry will be moved into the scheduled for publishing state. So that's why there's two areas in the entry listing for you to understand when something is actually going to be scheduled and what has a expiry schedule or publish schedule set. So in this example, we're just seeing all the entries that have an expiry schedule ready to unpublish that content set, and they're not dictated by the workflow, because you can unpublish an entry at any point. So you'll be able to see those, and these are all automatically ordered by the thing that's going to expire first. So that's entry scheduling. It's been a long-awaited feature, but it's all relied on this task service in the background to run off, and we're looking forward to rolling that out at the end of the month. So next area is user management. Now, some of these features have actually been pushed back to Contensis 15 already, so you might have already seen some of these changes. These have been rolled in over the last couple of weeks. So now under the user management screen, you can check for people that have got failed logins. This is great if you're using the security API to manage front-end logged in users who've failed to log in, and see who's failed. So on the left-hand filter now, there's this option to find out users that have failed login, when they've last failed to log in, and how many failed logon attempts they've had. So this is now surfaced under user management. This was available in Contensis Classic. We just weren't surfacing the data here in the user management screen. We've now brought over the login activity for users. So things like when their last successful login was, when they last changed their password, and how many failed logins since the last successful login. That's been brought into the user screen. That, along with being able to set an account expiry. So being able to say this particular user next week can no longer log into the system. And this is great if you've been using Contensis accounts for sort of temporary members of staff or consultants who come in to do a bit of work that you want to kind of remove their access. You can now search for groups in the groups listing screen. So when we first brought over users and groups into the new UI, you couldn't search against groups. So you can now do that by name or by type. And again, that's consistent with the other screens like users and entries. You can manage columns on this stuff and add extra detail into this view. Feature that you might not be aware about is that if you are using our security API to register users, you can actually automatically assign users to particular groups in the CMS by using this group assignment by domain feature. So you can go to a group, and I've just dummied up this registered website users group. So any user that registers with a contensis.com email address or a zengenti.com email address will be added to this group automatically. So that's going to allow you to potentially control content that's displayed on your front end site, or potentially what they can access in the CMS as well. We've made quite a lot of changes to the delivery API over the years. We're always kind of looking to make improvements, and I know there's some discussions going on. I know Onno's having some discussions with the team and has put some suggestions recently. But just a couple of things that have occurred with the delivery API recently is that you no longer need to do an extra URI lookup for linked entries. We now provide you that URL. So it saves you carrying out an extra search for linked entries, so that speeds up that flow. And we've also introduced a new feature to manage whether entries should be available on the delivery API. So if you're using the system to, manage order content into a back-end system, and you want to capture that order content, but you don't want it on the delivery API, you just want it available to the management API and to view that content in Contensis, there's now a toggle within the content type builder that allows you to determine whether something's included in delivery. It's on by default. If you turn it off on an active content type, what we'll actually do is remove that data from Elastic once you publish the content type, and all that content will disappear out of Elastic and so not be available on the delivery API. We've also spent a fair bit of time in the content type builder making some changes. We're always looking to kind of make improvements there. As you saw in the Leaf demo just then, when we were looking at nested components, we've introduced the ability to set up tab guidelines, just give an overview of what that tab content is used for. So it looks like that at the top of the screen. You set it under the content type builder tab settings, so you can click on the drop down next to a tab name, click on properties, and a dialog comes up for you to change the name of the tab and add some descriptions. And we've actually used the Markdown editor in there, so you can kind of set bold, italics, and links through the interface. And we've actually mimicked that same behavior in the content guidelines fields for fields as well. So you no longer need to write Markdown in order to style whether something should be bold or have a link. So that's all been updated as well. You might have noticed when we were building the component that there's been a bit of a change to our toolbox. So the toolbox now has a lot more fields displayed in the left-hand side, and we've done this for a couple of reasons. Over the years, I've seen a variety of feedback saying, oh, have we got a date range field and such? Because people weren't aware that you could insert a date field and then go to the editor properties and the editor format and change those settings. So rather than rely on you knowing that, we've surfaced these buttons to the top of the screen that then automatically apply those settings for you without you needing to go and kind of configure them. The other reason for doing this is we've talked for a little while about introducing the ability to create forms in Contensis. And so we've always said that forms will be built using the content type builder. And in order to do that, we're going to need to support a bunch of other field types, some of which are already available in the content type builder. So this process was kind of given a bit of a legs up towards heading towards building the forms builder and adding those extra fields in that you'd need, and the user experience you'd expect for building a form of like being able to choose directly the type of field that's going to be shown to a front-end user. So yeah, the toolbox has been updated. You'll also notice the icons have updated as well. So when you've got a markdown field now, it's no longer a generic rich text looking one. You get a specific icon, which then gets surfaced in things like composers as well. So it makes it clearer the type that you're kind of inserting. So we've also had to do quite a bit of overhauling within the content type builder as well for content types that are getting particularly complex. We've got some content types with over 100 fields in, and those fields are a mixture of kind of composer fields with lots of kind of different lookups and things with many tabs. So we've refactored the content type builder to support these kind of larger content types, and that was rolled out, I think, last week to the UI. For those who don't know, anything that doesn't rely on a change to our classic Contensis kind of installation, we can actually roll out these UI updates automatically, and we do that to all cloud users. Everyone gets kind of the latest version of the user interface, so some of these changes have been able to kind of go ahead without an upgrade. We continue to want to be a really accessible CMS. We've done a lot of work in the Contensis 14 release to make that a reality. We've been working with the Digital Accessibility Centre, which I've mentioned in previous webinars, and we've had their report back from them now. Now, whilst it was a large report, because obviously the CMS covers a lot of areas, the report detail actually pretty much got narrowed down into a couple of areas, predominantly around labeling of components in the system and how they were perceived to screen reader users. A couple of issues around kind of flashing text in lists and things. But generally the report was pretty good, and we're kind of working to produce an accessibility backlog at the moment to address those concerns that have the kind of highest priority. And John's going to be doing his webinar next, I think, September, and touching on like how we're tackling accessibility issues in Contensis. So yeah, there's a backlog underway, and we've also not stopped. We've continued to kind of work on accessibility. So you can now zoom the text size in site view. Previously, when you did that, the node properties panel didn't position itself correctly. So we've made that fix. We've made a bunch of screen reader updates, predominantly to the listing, any listing, so like the entries listing, the users, groups, and so on and so forth, about communicating like how many search results, how much data is displayed to the end user when you've changed the search filters. Also, when the search panel was closed in certain instances, then we were reading out the fields for that panel, which was unnecessary. We also tell you like the direction and order that a particular column of data in that data table is being sorted as well. So it gives you a kind of clear understanding of those things. So lots of kind of small improvements, and really the accessibility checklist that we had was lots of these kind of small improvements. So they'll filter through to our other components and other areas of the system that weren't tested, and bring kind of value there. Okay, just gonna have a drink, but the next area is about rich text editing and what we're doing around that area. So those of you who've been using Contensis for a while will be aware that we use the TinyMC rich text editor. We've been using this in Classic for years. We kind of built all our kind of templating to work within the TinyMC editor. But for those of you who've been around long enough, that took a considerable length of time to develop, sort of 18 months, 2 years in some instances, to use new versions of TinyMCE. And it's just really complex. And it's familiar. So for using rich text editing in an entry, for example, is really familiar to most users. They understand the editor toolbar, they understand how content's going to be styled. And so it's kind of like a natural thing to use. And there's pros and cons. As I said, it's familiar. Traditionally, it was WYSIWYG. We know that not to be true today with the responsive design and how content's consumed on the front end. So not necessarily how you put content in there is how it will be displayed. One of the downsides is it stores this content as HTML, which is great if you're producing a website, but not so great if you're building an application that needs to consume that same content, and it needs to have styling, but then you've got to strip that HTML and convert it and pass that content and do something else with it. The TinyMC editor is obviously an external third-party component as well, and this makes it really difficult for us to kind of customize or extend that editorial experience that we have. And when you start getting lots of TinyMC editors being used within the application in the same entry across tabs and what have you, then there's a real performance hit to the kind of end user and the redrawing of the UI and so on and so forth. So there are pros and cons of using this editor. But we've also got the simple MDE Markdown editor. So if you've got any kind of content that's brought in as Markdown content, it's great for textual content and long form content, especially if you've been writing content in another application outside of Contensis. And there is a bit of a learning curve for authors to understand the syntax, understand how to apply it. And whilst the toolbar is present for you to kind of insert bold text or italics, you've got to kind of get to grasp it and kind of get used to it. Again, it's another third-party editor, so it's difficult for us to extend. There's some real kind of strict specifications on how Markdown should be defined, and there's lots of people who've introduced kind of additional extensions to it, which are kind of Markdown style but aren't true to the Markdown specification. And this makes it really complicated to be interoperable between different systems in the way that that content is stored. So yeah, pros and cons. Good for long form content, And then you've got Contensis Composer Editor. So our Composer Editor allows us to take our content types and our kind of definition of components and build them together to create landing pages and long form content. We've been doing this since Contensis 9, and people have started to kind of get familiar with this approach. And it's super flexible for page builder experience of being able to drop a component in, reorder it, duplicate those components, and so on and so forth. But as I mentioned, we've got 2 other editors. This is a 3rd editor. It does give a bit of a kind of not great editing experience when you're kind of coming to long form content. But the value of it is we store this content as JSON, so we understand it, we can consume it how we want. So yeah, that's just a quick summary of the 3 editors. So we've got 3 different editors with a mixed editorial experience, which in turn has a mixed developer experience for us internally, for developing Contensis and managing that stuff, but a mixed developer experience on the front end on how you consume it. So are you consuming Markdown content? Are you consuming HTML? Are you consuming a mixture of those things as well as kind of simple strings of text? So yeah, kind of mixed developer experience. 3 different ways of storing content. We got HTML, Markdown, and JSON. Different rendering approaches for each of these. If you've got Markdown content, you've got to have a Markdown parser on the front end to convert that to HTML or to however you want to kind of consume it. If you've got it as HTML and you need to strip that out, you've got to parse that and strip it. And if you've got our Composer editor as JSON, you've got to handle the mixture of all those different types together as well. So we've been rethinking our editorial experience, and we've produced a new editor, which we're currently kind of calling Canvas. That's not the kind of final name, but it allows an author to create rich content made up of composed items and stores that content as JSON. So taking all the benefits from the 3 different editors that we've just seen and bringing them all together in one approach. We've taken the approach to be completely keyboard first. When you're writing long form content or textual content, you're predominantly using the keyboard. And that's not to say there won't be any UI around it, there absolutely will. But by taking a keyboard first approach, we cover all that kind of behavior without us needing to design a user interface that kind of works with it, which is our normal approach. We do a design, we carry out prototypes, and then we build the interface based on that look and feel. But there's so much complexity to an editor, this makes so much more sense for us in a development approach. You can create and edit content using the Markdown syntax. And we also support the pasting of Markdown content, as well as HTML content. So you can copy content from HTML and it'd be rendered into JSON into our editor. But if you're used to writing in that kind of IA writer style, Bear, Obsidian, any of those kind of Markdown editors outside of Contensis, then we'll support bringing that content in and styling it appropriately. And as I mentioned, we're going to store that content as JSON. And then as we store it, we're going to add some more definition to it to explain how that content is currently visually styled in the editor interface using what we're calling decorators. So that's talking about it. Let's look at it in practice. This feature isn't going to obviously make Contensis 15.1, but we hope to have something out by the end of the year on this. So let's head over to this CMS to have a look. So this isn't like the final how it's going to look or function. It's just giving you an idea of the functionality today. This is just our kind of development experience of it. So I've got some long form content, a mixture of textual content, images. We've got kind of bulleted lists and dividers in here at the moment. And just to say, this is not using any third-party editor. Everything's being written by our developers, so they've created a whole new kind of editorial experience. So everything you would gain by getting a third-party editor, sort of like text splitting or text formatting, we've had to write all of that from scratch. But one of the benefits of doing that is we get to decide how it behaves. So as I said, keyboard behavior is built in from the start. So you can kind of understand which content block you're in. You can use things like keyboard shortcuts to move content around. So I'm using Alt up and down. So in the past, in the TinyMC editor in Classic, trying to move sub-templates and templates around was a nightmare. You'd cut some code, you'd paste it in the code editor. No longer is that the case. You can just select a block and kind of move it around as you wish. Got the benefits of keyboard shortcuts, so you can do things like Command B or Command I or Control I to style that stuff. You can also begin to mark content as code, so you can do inline code snippets by using I can never think of the character name, but yeah, you can start to kind of wrap that up. You can do things like mark stuff as a keyboard element, so that will, if you want, render on the front end as a native HTML keyboard tag. You can do things like mark, so you can highlight content and have it highlighted in the UI. And we're probably going to extend like colors that you can highlight that text to. You can do things like, I want to show inserted text. It says, I think it's double. So inserted text or deleted text we can do. So you kind of got all that kind of keyboard behavior out of the box. You can then do things like, I want to insert something. So again, we can, I don't know, insert a table, and then you can start tabbing through the table contents and use the arrow keys to move around. So I can do heading 1, header 2. Get all the behavior you would get in like Google Sheets with keyboard selection, clearing, like row selection, so you can do shift space, you can do control space to select a column of data, you can duplicate that column of data to make it really easy. So even without any user interface laid on top of this, you've got full control of like determining how that content's produced. Even exiting out of tables, which is normally a nightmare in most editors, is easy to do. We also support things like inserting a code editor into the page, he says. Something's changed. So we go to code instead. So now I can add JSON into here. And this is using the Monaco editor. So you've got all the support that you normally get in Monaco with document formatting, go into definitions of that content, which is kind of really flexible. So that's a very quick overview. And how is this content stored? Well, I'm just going to go to make it a little bit more straightforward. So let's clear this content down and see how that content is stored as JSON in the background. So if I write this is a sentence and I preview, what we actually get now is when we come to save this in an entry, whatever your field name is, we'll save this data as you've created a paragraph with this value. This is a sentence. And at the moment, there's nothing to say how that's styled because it's simply a paragraph. So if I close that preview and now I change this to a heading, for example, so if I do #1 and I go to preview, we now tell it it's a heading. So we've depicted the type as a heading. And for anybody who's used to using the Composer editor and consuming Composer content, this is an extension of that format to enable kind of easily conversion from one type to the other. But you can see we've got these extra properties now. So I've said that this heading was a heading level 1, and that's defined there. Okay, so we've got a heading. Let's add another paragraph. So this is my example paragraph. If I want to style this text now, this word paragraph, to be bold, what happens? Well, I mentioned earlier that we're going to start storing this idea of decorators. So when we look at this paragraph now, we can see we've got a fragment of text. And first bit of the fragment is, this is my example. And the second fragment of text in that sentence was the word paragraph. And now it's decorated with strong. So why don't we just wrap that in a strong tag for HTML? Well, that's storing the content as HTML. So you'd have to strip it off if you weren't using HTML. Now, strong can mean whatever you want it to mean on the front end. So if that's a strong tag in HTML, you could output it as a strong tag. If you wanted to output it as a bold tag, a B tag, you could choose to render that content on the front end with a B tag. Or alternatively, it might be going into, I don't know, iOS's SDK, into one of their kind of text components, and you determine how that is consumed and how you determine that to be mapped on the front end. So content is basically broken down into types, and those types then contain fragments of text, and those fragments of text can then be decorated with the style that should be applied. And then you get funky things like I am a link, and if I select that text and do Command K to www.bbc.co.uk, press enter and have a look at this link, you can see that I am a is the first fragment of that paragraph, and the second fragment is the word link, and it's a link with a URL of bbc.co.uk. So you could wrap that in an A tag on the front end. You could wrap that inside however you want to kind of use that, put that into a button. How you choose to render that content is up to you. And then you get things like lists as well. So list item 1, list item 2. The other great thing is, I didn't show you, you can do keyboard commands like duplicate, so I can make that really quick. So I just did Command D or Control D on that content. So now you can see we've got a new piece of JSON here, which is a list. It's actually of type unordered, so it's an unordered list. And so again, you could spit that out as a UL-LI list on the front end, but you could, if you're using a particular design system that required a class of list and list item for each of those values, you can define that. When you haven't got to kind of take it past that HTML to insert how you want it to be rendered. You just determine how you want that to be rendered. And then each list item is made up of fragments again. So again, each list item can be broken down into their constituent parts. So can have links, can have bold text, and so on and so forth. I haven't shown you everything today in this editor, and as I said, it's still a work in progress, but as you can see, everything from merging and splitting sentences, moving content around, navigating around the document is all keyboard possible. Support bold, italic, underline, subscript, superscript, headings, lists, inline code, keyboard inputs, variables, strike throughs. So a pretty comprehensive editor. We're really excited in the direction it's going. We've still got a lot of work to do. So one of the things that we're going to have to start thinking about is how do we import content into this structure? How do we consume that content at API level? Do you make a request from the REST service and say, give me it as HTML, give it me as Markdown, give it to me as JSON? Or do we provide like an NPM package to choose how that content can be rendered in like the JavaScript delivery API? What I didn't show you is, if I close this, yeah, go back to preview. So that was it in JSON. If I want to request that same data, but as Markdown now, we can automatically convert it to Markdown correctly, which makes it really great when we want to kind of import and export, because you could say, select all this content and copy it as Markdown, or copy it as pure HTML. If I format this, we got the full HTML there that we could copy. And actually internally, we've been testing the rendering of all this content. So we've got it rendering in a React component, which has got a custom table of contents at the beginning that allows you to kind of go through this content. We've got custom view templates running to do a similar approach. That's actually the view renderer doing the same thing. So we've just been working on how can we consume that JSON in all these kind of common frameworks. And that was done over a couple of days to kind of support those. So that's a Canvas editor. As I said, won't be in 15.1, but hopefully have something out by the end of the year to start using. I've touched on all the current support. These slides will be available after in the video, so you can kind of go back and see. But we're also going to be working on images, call-out boxes, MathJax equations, embeds, linking to entries and such, as well as supporting components inline. So we're really excited by that. So quick recap: introduce nested components and the ability to add those subcomponents, make it more modular. Introducing entry schedules, the ability to manage publish and expiry schedules. Some additional resolution for linked entry URLs in the delivery API, and the new option to include entries in delivery. Bunch of changes around users and groups. Handful of accessibility updates with a progression on how that's going to be going forward. This new Canvas editing experience, which we see as the future. So as normal, carry on the conversation in Slack. Obviously, we will take any questions now, but thank you for your time today. We're really looking forward to releasing at the end of August or thereabouts. That's the time frame we're working to.